So when you're looking at what really galvanized support for the anti-war movement and is going to really lead to something that we'll talk about in a few minutes called the credibility gap, you think about what the shock at the Tet offensive. You think about the revelations about what happened at My Lai. You think about the admission that the United States was attacking Cambodia, which certainly led to Kent State, where protesters were killed by U.S. military. I mean, the Ohio National Guard, but it is still sort of our own military. And then we find our way to something called the Pentagon Papers, which will be the subject of the movie that we're going to watch next week, called The Post. Now, it's important to understand what the Pentagon Papers were. Back in 1967, so this is still with LBJ, the U.S. Secretary of Defense, Robert McNamara, said, "I want to know what has happened in Vietnam." So he asked for a highly classified study of the U.S. political and military involvement in Vietnam, basically from the end of World War II. So that's all the way back with Harry Truman supporting the French as they fought off the Viet Minh. Now, the technical title of the Pentagon Papers is Report of the Office of the Secretary of Defense Vietnam Task Force. Now, it's a top secret report, and it's completed 2 years later. It's 47 volumes, 3,000 pages, 4,000 pages of supporting documents. The guy's name we need to know is Daniel Ellsberg, who'd helped write this report. And originally, he'd been a supporter of Vietnam, but by 69, when it comes out, he's definitely against the war. And he believes that, after having seen what's in the Pentagon Papers, that the U.S. decision-making about Vietnam needs to be revealed to the American people, because he just believes that it's become way too shady and that people aren't being told the truth. So he's got another job at this point in the early 70s, 1971. He's actually working at MIT, and he says, "I got to get this information out to the American people. How am I going to do it?" So he gives it to someone at the New York Times after he'd already tried to basically give it to people in Congress to take action, and they didn't. The New York Times is going to run a series of front-page articles about it, and it's really eye-opening to the American people, because it's going to talk about basically what Truman had done, what Eisenhower had done, and particularly about how Kennedy and LBJ had misled the public about the degree of the U.S. involvement in Vietnam, especially about how LBJ kept saying, the end is near, just as they're escalating the war at Vietnam. Now, this does not implicate Nixon. So Nixon is the president at the time, but he's not involved in this because the report was written prior to him. So despite the fact that Richard Nixon is going to fight against the Pentagon Papers being published, it actually doesn't go after him at all. The U.S. government will sue to try to get this blocked. And there's a famous case called the New York Times versus the United States, where the New York Times and the Washington Post, two major newspapers, joined together to fight for the right to publish this. And actually, the Supreme Court ruled in their favor, saying the government had failed to prove that this information would harm national security, and that the publication of the papers were justified under, again, the First Amendment's protection of freedom of the press. This is a huge win for the freedom of the press, and in many ways a huge win for the American people, because they get to find out what's going on. And it is definitely a huge loss for the government, because now people are being told what has really happened. In many ways, it confirmed suspicion that the government had not been upfront with what was going on. Again, sort of backing up all this evidence that you had seen prior to that. And so when you look at the idea of Tet, of Cambodia, of Kent State, the Pentagon Papers, it's going to open up something called the credibility gap, which was actually a term that was not new. It had actually been coined about 10 years earlier. But it's the idea that the government is not telling the truth and that people can't trust the government. Now, you may say, well, haven't people always mistrusted the government? No, that's actually what's interesting. For essentially, 2 centuries, what the government said, the people believed. They had no reason to feel like the government was misleading them. And so that's one of the main legacies of the Vietnam War. It's not only just the anti-war protests that people are going to say, we're actively fighting against a war, which, despite the fact that you'd seen this in some smaller cases in U.S. history, hadn't been prominent. But really this idea that the government could be lying to you, the government could be manipulating you, and you're going to combine that with what happens soon thereafter with Richard Nixon and Watergate, which I'm not going to go into great detail here, but when you find out that the president had actually, okayed the bugging of his opponent's office at the Democratic National Committee in the Watergate Hotel, and that the president repeatedly had lied to the American people and to other people in the government as well. One of the backlashes that you're going to see is that there's going to be an election of Jimmy Carter in 1976 after Nixon steps down and Gerald Ford takes over for him. But Jimmy Carter was seen as this sort of aw shucks, honest guy from Georgia who really would never tell a lie. And so we sort of swing back to trying to find the last honest politician in many ways. When we sort of have to do a final evaluation of what happened in Vietnam, we got to look first at how many people died. And again, you're going to see over 500,000, 635,000 South Vietnamese died. The number of Viet Cong, again, the communist sympathizers that were working with North Vietnam, that were in South Vietnam, and North Vietnamese army, their dead totaled about 1 million. There's severe environmental damage, and something I hadn't really talked about, but what you're going to see not only is bombing, but you're going to see defoliants in terms of something called Agent Orange, which is going to be used to try to get leaves off of trees, because if you're fighting a guerrilla war, you want to be able to take away hiding places. There's major damage that goes on in Vietnam that the country still hasn't totally recovered from. Then you're going to see about 1.5 million South Vietnamese that are going to have to leave the country. They actually become refugees after North Vietnam takes over in 1975. In terms of American losses, you're going to have almost 60,000 Americans killed, 300,000 wounded, 2,500 soldiers that are still, missing in action, quote unquote, to this day. And many troops received quite a negative welcome when they came home, despite the fact that they were fighting a war that they were drafted into, that the government made them go to. So, people were blamed for fighting an unpopular war, despite the fact that they may not have wanted to be there at all. You're going to see this trouble adjusting to civilian life. We now are really talking at this point sort of about post-traumatic stress. And, we have to look at this in terms of the Cold War. What did this do? Absolutely nothing. You're going to see that Vietnam is a communist country. Now, Cambodia will also become communist, sort of a different communist under the Khmer Rouge, but it doesn't have a full domino effect going all the way across, but certainly there was some domino that had gone on. If you look at the total cost, $150 billion, and this is at a time where Lyndon Johnson is trying to support his Great Society and his war on poverty. And it really is challenging over the course of the 60s to try to both address, civil rights and help bring people up, while at the same time fighting an incredibly expensive war abroad. And it's really going to be the downfall of LBJ that he can't do both. Again, you've got that credibility gap that I just talked about. And in many ways, this leads to something that Congress does in 1973 called the War Powers Act, or the War Powers Resolution. And it's meant to close the loophole of the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution. Remember, the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution basically gave a blank check, said, hey, LBJ, do whatever you need to do to escalate this war without ever actually having declared war. Well, the War Powers Act reins the president in, and it says, if you're going to commit troops anywhere, then you have to get approval from Congress within 48 hours, and they can only be there for a certain amount of time before they have to come home, basically saying you can't have some sort of indefinite conflict that is not a war. If you want a war, you got to get a declaration of war. Anything else, you really, your power is limited.